Okay, we're live, Laura, but the music's still playing. And I give out, hang on, let me unmute you.
Gotcha. Hi.
Hi, I gotta give out some Pine points first to my biggest fans. Usually whoever shows up first to the live stream gets Pine points.
Okay.
Today it's a new name that I don't recognize. It's One Spoon at a Time. So 1 spoon at a time, 1,000 Pine points for you.
Where are Pine points redeemable?
Oh, great question.
All right.
So get this. If you get 1,000,000 Pine points, you get an all-expense-paid trip with me to the luxurious Tropicana Casino and Spa in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Oh, good lord. That's insane. You have to save up for quite a while, I guess. So.
And I give them out about 1,000 at a time. Actually,
okay, how many do you get for being on the live stream?
I will give you. Actually, I really like you, so I'm going to give you 25,000 Pine points.
That's extremely generous. All right, I'm well on my way.
And I believe that's the most I've ever given out. But I do have the power. Well, actually, it's not me who has the power. I have a head office. PineCreek has a head office in Wichita, Kansas, where they keep track of all the Pine points and everything. And if I get a call from the CEO there, we can subtract points if you're naughty. So as long as you're not naughty, your 25,000 Pine points are good to go. Good start.
All right, we got quite an operation here.
I got to ask you. Well, before we even get in who you really are. Did you watch my last video of you?
I did. I found out about it halfway through the live stream, just because somebody tweeted me and said, oh my gosh, someone's doing a show about you right now. So of course I had to open a couple of beers and watch it for myself.
That's a good idea to watch it with 2 beers.
Gathered my husband and a few of my friends around.
Oh no!
So, yeah.
Your husband watched?
Oh yeah, no, we all watched. No, some of my friends watched. My co-host of the New Testament review watched, and we all had a good laugh about it. So,
what did your husband say when I said I loved you?
He was deeply creeped out on that. Sorry. Scott says he loves you too. So.
Well, you knew what I meant when I said that, because so often I think me and other non-Christians or atheists, whatever you want to call them, we get so frustrated with these evangelical apologists that it's so refreshing to hear a person like you just say no.
Yeah, no, and it's not the first time we've talked about apologetics on our show before, on the New Testament. We'll get into what that is in a second, but I think that even in the scholarly guild, there are a lot of Christians who study history pretty critically and pretty intently, and even then, that it's a very different project from the apologetic project, right? So, and that's what we're getting into on the show.
Yeah. Just to catch people up who might have no clue what's going on here, you did a podcast with your friend Ian, is it?
Ian Mills.
Is he a fellow grad student?
Yeah, we're both PhD candidates at Duke.
Okay. And so you guys have a podcast called?
The New Testament Review is our show. And the idea of the show is that we review classic pieces of New Testament scholarship and just sort of give a summary of it and talk about our reactions to it, how we feel about it, whether we agree or we disagree. And it's sort of supposed to be an entry point to people who otherwise might not get to read a lot of New Testament scholarship or might not have a lot of familiarity with it. It's just trying to make New Testament scholarship available to a wider audience.
Okay. And I listened to most of that episode you had on Lee Strobel, and then I watched all of the episode when you went on Hayden's show, Help Me Believe, and I really loved it. Just summarize for people who might have missed that, how badly you scathed Lee Strobel.
Well, so to be clear, we would never normally do a show on Lee Strobel, right? Or just most apologetics in general. The point of this show is that we do scholarly research, right? That's what we research.
Wait. Are you saying Lee Strobel has nothing to do with scholarly research?
Well, it's in a weird in-between place, right? Because he interviews scholars, and and it's hard to know in a lot of the book where the mistakes, where the missteps are happening, right? Like, are they happening at the interview level? Because he does interview people who are professors in the New Testament. One of whom is extremely important in this history of New Testament studies, Bruce Metzger, and then a few others of whom are less so. But then his entree into this itself is his journalist and pastoral background. Frankly, that's probably doing a lot more heavy lifting than the journalism side. But that's how he gets into it. Anyways, we would normally never do that on our show, right? We would normally never talk about a book like that. But we last year played an April Fool's prank on our listeners where we started to act like we were going to review. We did like our whole intro and we set it up as though this was going to be our piece of scholarship, and then we just burst out laughing and said April Fools and turned off the camera, and so it was just to mess with people, right? And then when we started talking about what we were going to do for April Fools this year, we thought about, like, well, what if we actually do this, so and that's what just got us on this, and it wasn't really a scholarly project. It started out as a joke, but then it turned into something really interesting. And
in that video with Hayden and on the podcast, it really sounded like to me, and this is maybe where you disagreed with me when I did my video on you. It really sounded like you were saying you weren't calling Lee Strobel a liar. I'm not. Let's be clear, but you were. I phrased it as you were. Lee Strobel was taking extreme artistic license. Is that a good summary?
I don't know what his story is. I know nothing about the production of this book. I just know what's in the text, and it seems like there are a few things that don't add up. And he acknowledges very late in the book. It's like on page 270 or something that he that these weren't actually the interviews that led him to become a Christian, but it's like with a little glancing blow where he just kind of quickly acknowledges it, and then but for the vast majority of the book, he's taking on this, I'm a skeptic persona, and I'm going to, take this, and it just doesn't make any sense. That can't be what really happened.
Yeah. What do you think really happened?
I mean, if I had to guess, like, my reading between the lines instinct is that he became a Christian because his wife did, which is a reason a lot of people become Christians, right? And I think for some people there's a need to feel like, and this is the role I think a lot of times apologetics plays, is that the need or the desire or the relational or the charismatic component of Christianity feels like an insufficient, or dare I say humbling, reason to be a Christian. So we need to make this seem like it's an inevitable consequence of just using your reason or using your journalist brain, that you have no other choice than to conclude. And I think that's kind of how do I put this kindly? I think it's putting on some airs, to be honest. I think there are lots of good reasons to be a Christian, but I don't think journalistic inevitability is one of them. So I like I said, I don't know what his story was. I don't know what really happened. I just know that he became a Christian way before the interviews in this book happened. I would be shocked if apologetics had anything to really do with it. And honestly, if the story was just that he was depressed and Christianity pulled him out of it, that sounds like a better story anyways. I read that book, so yeah.
In your studies at Duke, have you heard about the PineCreek theorem?
No.
The PineCreek theorem says that more women have converted men to Christianity than the Holy Spirit could ever do.
I really do think, I mean, Christian women outnumber Christian men substantially. I think there's a lot of sociological reasons why that's the case, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So would you categorize, who do you think of the evangelical Protestant historical realm, like I won't name names, I'll leave it open, who you think is doing unbiased, really good, scholarly, historical New Testament history?
Yeah. So I would really want to push against the label unbiased just to start.
Well,
You
as
know,
much as possible, you know.
I
It's
know, no, I know. And I think that, I mean, all scholarship comes from a perspective. And I think that the best approach as a scholar is not to try to get rid of your perspective, but to acknowledge it and to where necessary, push against it. This is, I think, a huge part of the historian's task. But within the world of just scholars who claim an evangelical label and are robust historians, there's a lot. There's a lot. I mean, my personal favorite, just because I worked with her and she's amazing, is Karen Jobes. She's a Septuagint New Testament scholar who's emeritus at Wheaton College. She's terrific.
is she an evangelical Protestant type, or is she more
Yeah,
mainline?
very much an evangelical. Yeah. I mean, evangelicals often claim him, even though I don't think he is strictly speaking an evangelical. But Richard Hayes would fall under that heading. He's quite conservative.
What do you think of Richard Bauckham?
It depends on the project. It depends. I mean, he knows his stuff, right? He's not messing around. He's no slouch. I have an issue with some of his theories. But at that point, this happens with all historians, though, right? You know, we're always.
Can I try to read your mind? Your issue with Richard Bauckham is his defense of eyewitness testimony in Luke. Am I right?
Yeah. His book on Revelation is great. I think a lot of his stuff on Revelation and the Gospel of John is very good. But I think a lot of the issues with the whole named figures as living tradents, I was living witnesses to the traditions of Jesus. I think that's a very problematic thesis. I think a lot of, generally speaking, I think historians really like the idea that the more detail you have in a text, the more eyewitness historical details you have. And I don't know why this is something we think, because it doesn't apply to a lot of things we talk about in scholarship, right? Or a lot of things that we talk about in history. Like a lot of the Gnostic Gospels have more named figures, or they have more visual details, and because people can and do invent names and invent visual details. And like, do I think Rhoda, the servant girl in Acts, do I think she's made up by Luke? No, I don't think we have enough data to say that. But I think it's surprising to start from the assumption that she must be a real person Luke specifically knew who told him this story. You know, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between those, which is how all of history works. It's always one of those. It's always one of those things.
And do you have any opinion on guys like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, who really espouse the minimal facts type stuff?
I really know. I could not tell you a single thing about like Mike Licona. My colleague Ian does some stuff with that. I mean, I'm loosely familiar with Gary Habermas's argument. You know, I mean, just the problem is, like, generally speaking, this is just not what historians are doing all day, right? Like, we're just not reading this kind of thing. But I'm loosely familiar with a lot of what Gary Habermas has done. And I think, generally speaking, if I just had to like identify like a major historical issue right off the top of my head, it would be treating the gospel accounts of the resurrection as independent witnesses. When we know for a fact they're using each other, right? They're using each other. At the very least, two people are using Mark. We've got Matthew and Luke. Virtually every scholar in the world thinks that Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke. And then I think there's a decent chance John is using Mark too. I wouldn't rule it out. And then even people who don't think John is using Mark think there might be some sort of pre-existent passion source.
Do you think?
Right?
Do you think the author of Mark used Paul?
I think he did. But I don't think it's all he used. I think he used a lot of stuff, but I think Mark has some Pauline fingerprints on it. I mean, here's the lousy thing about being a historian, right? Is we only have the sources we have. So it's very easy for us to be like, oh, this looks like Peter, this looks like Paul, because these are the only two guys we know, right? So I don't know when I say that Mark has Pauline fingerprints, I don't think that means something as direct as like Mark personally knew Paul, right? But I do think there's a very good chance that Mark's gospel came from Gentile churches that were more skeptical of Torah observance as a mark of Christian conversion, right? As opposed to something like Matthew.
Do you think Acts, the author of Acts, used Josephus?
I think it's a possibility. Yeah, I definitely think it's a possibility. There's a great T.W. Mason article about this. I have there's some professors at Duke who are actually working on this right now. The overlap of historical figures that are cited in both, I definitely think that's a possibility. Yeah.
Okay. Everything you say, just my mind is like, I don't have free will. It's just like things are popping in my head. And so I'm kind of like, but I got so many things to ask you. But getting back to Habermas and the minimal facts thing.
What do you mean by minimal facts? I don't know.
Well, he says, this is how he says something like this. He says that whether you're a Christian scholar or not, it seems like professionals in this field, I'm getting an echo now. Let me turn down your volume a bit. That over 70 or 75% of scholars, the majority agree on certain minimal facts.
Okay.
And I think it sometimes uses up to 12 or 13 minimal facts, and sometimes it's like 4.
Would the minimal facts be
that Jesus was crucified?
Jesus was crucified. Okay, that's definitely, I would say, consensus view. Everyone accepts that.
And the disciples had experiences that led them to believe that Jesus was risen.
Yeah.
He used to have empty tomb, but I think he removed that.
That's a tough one because our first source for that is Mark, and we don't. Yeah, I think that the tomb being empty is one of those things that exists on the line between. Yeah, I don't think it's, with the tools of history we have, I wouldn't call it provable or disprovable. I don't think there's a good reason to think it didn't happen, but I don't think Mark being our first source for this is tricky, right? But there are lots of things that Mark is our first source for, and we think it's historical, so
But the main impetus of the whole minimal facts argument is that there's this idea of scholarly consensus.
Yeah.
And from your knowledge, is there a database or a survey of professional New Testament scholars or historians that goes through all these claims and says, oh yeah, I believe this is more likely to have happened than not? Like, do you buy that number that 75% of scholars agree to?
Yeah.
You know what I'm getting at?
That's a good question. Honestly, there should be. That would actually be a really cool resource, just on some like binary issues in New Testament studies.
Dissertation idea.
I am neck deep in a dissertation. I am not starting over.
Okay.
Scholarly consensus is a thing that exists, right? Like this is definitely a thing. But I think our perceptions of it can be a bit they're definitely very localized, right? So I think it's very easy for me to say like, oh yeah, everyone thinks that. But what I really mean is everyone at Duke thinks that, and all of our friends think that, and so it's everyone. All of scholarship is working in networks, right? So a lot of the stuff is very generational. A lot of the stuff is very regional or national. Or language-based, things that are consensus in Germany are often not consensus in English-speaking universities. But generally speaking, yes, there is an identifiable thing called scholarly consensus around a range of issues in New Testament studies. Some of those have changed a lot in the last 20 years. I think 30 years ago, scholarly consensus would have said that there was definitely a queue. But now I think it's... there's a pretty big Q skeptic contingent. Historical Jesus studies is a tough. Historical Jesus studies in a lot of ways hasn't changed a lot in a while. So there's definitely there are definitely some things I think scholars would generally agree on with the historical Jesus. I don't know how many of the 12-item list there would be. The crucifixion would definitely be on it.
Yeah.
I think that's about as unimpeachable as anything in history can be, especially when we're talking about history of peasants, right? Like that's another challenging issue, that we're not talking about history of emperors. We're talking about lay people, common figures, right? So.
Tell me if I'm right. I got the basic gist of how you do history. So basically, you can say something is more likely to have happened in the past if you have multiple attestation, like independent sources. If something's written closer to the actual event or purported event rather than later. Let's see, what else? Those are the big ones, right?
Yeah, and then from there, there's some more constructive work you can do with coherence, right? Something that coheres with, if we have sources that are closer to an event or multiple independent attestations of something, later sources that cohere with what we already know about it, those things might get a bit more credence, right? So that's, of course, you're moving out from concentric circles from your level of certainty, but. But I definitely think coherence is a big part of it.
I seem to hear evangelical apologist type historians say include in that list of criteria for historicity is the criterion of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a good one or not?
It's complicated, right? Because for one thing, the criterion of embarrassment was not invented by evangelicals. It was invented by I think it was Charles Worth, actually. It's a mainline university idea. This was not a thing that was invented by evangelicals. I think it can be helpful and also not helpful. The biggest challenge to it is that it's very hard to understand what would be embarrassing in history.
You're right.
So we obviously don't. We're working with reconstructions of what people would have valued or not valued, and that puts some limits on what would have been embarrassing or not embarrassing. The other thing that is tough is that a lot of mythical figures in the ancient world have very embarrassing truths about them. There were castrated gods in antiquity, right? And that's alongside the fact that being castrated is deeply shameful in antiquity. There are murdered gods. It does happen that shameful and embarrassing things happen to mythical figures. So it doesn't follow from there that a figure that has embarrassing things happen to them or humiliating things happen to them must not be mythical at all, right? It doesn't follow. But at the same time, I do think there are things where we can see discomfort with an idea that suggests that people were moving away from that early historians or documenters of an event were moving away from something that did exist in the tradition. So the classic example of this is Jesus being baptized by John. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus goes down to the water, John baptizes him, and the other gospel writers seem to be very uncomfortable with this detail, right? So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus goes down to the Jordan, and John baptizes him, but John has to be talked into it, right? He says, I need to be baptized by you, and Jesus says that this will fulfill all righteousness. I can't remember what happens in Luke. Gosh darn it. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. And then in John, Jesus doesn't get baptized at all. He just walks by while John is baptizing. So that does suggest that early Christian writers were particularly uncomfortable with this one detail, right? And the fact that they were trying to figure out what to do with it suggests that this probably was a well-known idea early on. It might have been argued by big fans of John the Baptist, like, oh, look, John the Baptist even baptized Jesus. But later writers weren't as comfortable with that idea. So that is a place where you can see the embarrassment idea actually it work. But it's harder when you're talking about something a lot more cosmic, right? It's a lot bigger where we don't see that level of reaction. So the idea that women are the first people to see Jesus raised, right? On one hand, yeah, of course, this is a really surprising detail because women wouldn't be witnesses in the ancient world, or they would be generally considered less credible. We have reports of the disciples not believing the women themselves. And then
do you buy that personally? that's embarrassing? Women at the tomb?
Maybe I wouldn't rule it out. It's one of those I'm sorry. This is a tough one because it gets to the question of like embarrassing to who, right? I don't.
Well,
So there's another.
I'll tell you about my take, and maybe you can riff off it. I've listened to guys like Tim Keller, who's a preacher, pastor, and he'll make comments like it was the women and the slaves' job to put spices on dead. The men wouldn't touch the dead. I don't know if that's true or not.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Not the spices in John.
Yeah. And apparently,
and Nicodemus
exactly. And the people who push against that mentioned that exact same thing. But it's pretty safe to assume that women did put spices on dead bodies in that culture. And so it wouldn't be embarrassing for the women to show up the tomb to do that because they maybe ran out of time to do it on Friday night or whenever.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't really see that as necessarily embarrassing. I think it's mostly a story. And that would fit into the story in context for that time. And then there's other verses in the Bible that says that people were converted to Christianity because of the testimony of women. At least one woman in the Gospel of John. And so that shows that that shows that women's testimony was very important. For the most important thing in Christendom is becoming a Christian.
If you think the empty tomb is I actually think the empty tomb probably has more historical credence than the Samaritan lady does. To be totally honest, I would want to put a big pin in that. I think that the Samaritan woman might be doing some theological work there. In the idea that she is specifically an unreliable witness is the thing that John is really interested in. Here's what I would say. It is absolutely true that the testimony of women was less credible than the testimony of men in the ancient world. That is itself absolutely true. Does it follow from that you would never invent a story that women were the first thing to witness something? I don't know if that does. I don't know if it necessarily does. There's another classic explanation of where the women come in, and that's as this is in a book called Her Share of the Blessings by Ross. Gosh darn it, what is her last name? Google, the book, Her Share of the Blessings. Google it. She throws out that the women were introduced to bridge the gap between the original resurrection story and the empty tomb narrative. That the reason why we haven't been hearing the empty tomb narrative is specifically because women weren't being listened to for so long, and that's how they find their way into the story, which I think it's an equally plausible explanation of the data. I think that women are that the reason that you might invent a story with women in it to explain why the story took a really long time to emerge and become a major part of the testimony, right? I think that's another possibility. So,
are you willing to put a number on what percentage? Well, let's just stick with the Gospel of Mark because that's the first gospel. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, absolutely.
What percentage, if we had a video camera, went back in a time machine and we could videotape it, what percentage of the content in the Gospel of Mark do you think actually could be recorded in the past? If you were to put a percent on it.
This is a tough one because, again, we're always talking about probabilities, right?
Right.
So, I mean, how much of it do there's a few different questions we're asking here, right? Like, one is, how much do I, Laura Robinson, think happened?
Right, just your opinion.
Right, but I also think this is a separate question from how much can we prove using the tools of history happened. On that side, the answer is not very much. But I don't think, but I want to be really cautious with how I say that. I want to put a giant pin in that because it doesn't follow from that most of it didn't happen. It just means that the kinds of sources that historians usually depend on to construct these things don't exist because these are not stories about elite wealthy figures. These are stories about poor people, and poor people don't leave as much of a paper trail as others do. So that's the big change. How much of it do I think happened? Gosh, in Mark, I'm having a hard time thinking of anything that I would put a big asterisk for. Absolutely not, to be honest.
Well,
Because like, where I do think you.
I'm asking for like 51% or higher that you think probably did happen. What percentage?
I would say 51% or higher. Yeah, I mean, I think when you get into something like Matthew, you get things that I think definitely didn't happen. You know, like John the Baptist saying, you know, I need to be baptized by you. I think that's a pretty easy no. And I can't think of any easy no's in Mark, to be honest.
Can I show you what I worked on about? It's probably a year. It's
Yeah.
probably a year ago. Hang on.
Yeah.
You can't see that, can you? Hang on. Let me see.
I can see it going over the screen.
Yeah, let me screen capture it. So I did this about a year ago using, I forget the source. So I don't expect you to be able to read any of this. Just look at the
Oh God, the nightmare.
This is the Gospel of Mark. Just copy.
What are you trying to do to me? I can't see this.
No. Don't. Just look at the colors, okay?
I'm messing with you.
Okay, so this is the Gospel of Mark that I copy and pasted into Word.
Okay.
And then what I did is I said, okay, look, if there's a parable, that's something, you could say that the parable was told in history, but the actual content of the parable didn't happen in the past. It's a parable. It's a story.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, of course. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But nobody, even the most conservative scholars, don't argue that there was really a farmer who cast seed on 4 different kinds of soil, and that's not a position anybody holds.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
parables, yeah.
So what I did is all the parables I highlighted in red in the Gospel of Mark. So wherever you see red's a parable.
That's a parable.
And then if the author of the Gospel of Mark quoted the Old Testament, I highlighted in pink.
Okay.
So it's really hard to tell.
The hot pink or
the hot pink, yeah.
Hot pink, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, because the Old Testament's very important, so I made it hot pink. And then this is where most people would agree with that. That the quoting the Old Testament is not a history unfolding. Parables is not history unfolding. Now this is where we start to get into disagreements. The violet color is what I would call Old Testament imitation or mimesis. So basically, even in Mark chapter 1, where Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, could be taken from. Is it First Kings with
Elijah and Elisha?
Yeah, and that story actually happened at the Jordan, just like Jesus and John the Baptist happened at the Jordan.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was Elisha's start of his ministry, and just like Jesus, the start of his ministry. So that's all. So anything like that, which you can get pretty close. In fact, a lot of Christians, evangelicals especially, don't deny this. They say, well, this is Jesus found in the Old Testament, and so this is foreshadowing of Jesus. And a lot of them actually will say this in their messages when they preach. And so that's in violet. Then in green is fulfilled prophecies. So I know Mark doesn't do this as much as Matthew. Matthew says, these things were written that you may know, or to fulfill the prophecy of X. But
this happens without the word of
But I would view the green stuff very similarly to the violet stuff in that it's basically, one could argue that someone's reading the Old Testament using it as a template to create a new narrative to fulfill prophecy. So that's in green, and that's where probably a lot of Christians would disagree with me. And then in brown is outside sources, literary devices, non-biblical mimesis. So anything that's not a parable, but clearly a literary device is in brown.
You have a lot of brown. You have a lot of non-biblical literary devices, and I think that might be. I would have to look exactly at what you pulled up. I don't know how that might put a lot more of a classical education. That might describe more of a classical education of the gospel writers than they would have realistically had. This is the biggest issue with the whole, like Mark is based on the Odyssey or something. I think there's a reasonably good chance that Mark had absolutely no idea what the Odyssey was.
Really?
these are not educated people. These are like workaday laymen. They are writing in trade manual Greek. Like, that is the level of writing we are working with here. If there is a text they are familiar with, it is the Septuagint. So that I would really want to push back on the idea that there are classical allusions or literary allusions coming into the New Testament just on the ground of where are they getting it.
You said something that really caught my attention. You said you didn't think that the author of the Gospel of Mark knew who Homer was, or used Homer, or
I wouldn't know. I don't know about knew who Homer was, right? But I definitely think I would assume Mark had not read Homer. I don't know where Mark would have done that, because a lot of times where you would get this is you would be educated at home. People who had a classical education, you'd get educated at home by your slave, or you would have or you would go to a school where your parents were paying tuition. But this is an upper level thing to do,
so you don't envision the gospel author of Mark being an upper level, highly educated.
No. He doesn't. No. His Greek is not at that level at all. I mean, he's not totally uneducated, because he can write, which is a huge deal in the ancient world. Like less than 5% of people are able to read and write. So, but there's different levels of literacy, right? And when you look at the way Mark writes, he sounds a lot more like he's writing in trade manual Greek, right? This is the kind of Greek that you write. Like scientific or medical journals, which medical journals now, that sounds very elite. Back then, it was absolutely not. So Mark does not have a classical education. No.
See, I'm just a farm kid from Manitoba, Canada, but I've read some Shakespeare, and I'm just
no, for sure. But you also live in a literary society, right? And it is much more. Like, we have public education. We have. We teach children how to read. This is not a thing that most people in the ancient world would have been doing. Like, you might have had enough arts and letters to sign your name or to read a receipt or a contract. But for the most part, if you wanted to hear the Torah read, you would go to a synagogue. And if you wanted to hear rhetorical teaching, you would go to the agora and hear a public speaker. You wouldn't go buy this book yourself. Books are way too expensive, and most people can't read. That the most generous estimation of literacy in the ancient world is between 5 and 10%. I would not assume that Mark had a classical education. Absolutely not. In fact, I think the Greek speaks directly against that.
But getting back to that color-coded thing I showed you, when you do look at all that, what's left in black, what is, I thought, historical, and it was like 10-15%. And so I'm just wondering, if you were to do the same thing I did, how different our numbers would be.
Yeah, so here's a few things I would want to push back on. Is I think when you have recapitulation of the Old Testament, that is not the same thing as not historical, for two reasons. One is that these people are consciously modeling themselves off of Old Testament figures, right? Like, this is a thing that is well attested in the ancient world, that people would, if they saw themselves as having some kind of prophetic role, they would consciously take on the trappings of an Old Testament figure they admire, and they would carry this out. This is talked about in Josephus, for instance, right? Like, Josephus knows of a few different people who went down to the Jordan and said that they were going to go split it, or they went up to the Mount of Olives and said they were going to tell the walls of Jerusalem to fall down like the walls of Jericho. And it doesn't mean this isn't historical. It means that people are modeling themselves off of the legends that are sustaining their religious life, right? And I think that's absolutely what's happening with John the Baptist. So John the Baptist, there's this detail that he wears camel's fur all over him, right? Which is a very strange thing to do, right? That he would just take camel's fur and put it all over him. Well, it makes more sense if you go back to the Old Testament and you see that Elijah is said to be a hairy man, right? So it looks like John the Baptist's problem is that he's not hairy, but he wants to be Elijah, right? So he's got the loincloth, he's got the Jordan, he's got locusts and honey, but he doesn't have the hair. So what's he do? He goes and he gets camel's hair, right? And I think this is almost certainly a historical detail. So I think what you have there is that's not Mark inventing that. If Mark was just inventing this, he would have just made John the Baptist hairy, right? But the fact that John the Baptist is wearing hair suggests that he's solving a hair related problem for his of self-understanding. And I think a lot of this is probably what's happening with the with the story of Jesus. One of the best attested and most independently attested thing about Jesus is that he has 12 disciples, right? Which, 12 tribes, 12 restored Israel, 12 tribes of restored Israel. And I don't think that's well attested because everyone just keeps inventing this about Jesus. I think it's because Jesus picked 12 disciples with the 12 tribes in mind, right?
Okay.
So I think that's one thing I would want to say. The other thing is that a gospel writer noticing things through the sort of like exhaustive knowledge of the Old Testament and drawing parallels where they see them and kind of like maybe even engaging in some parallelomania, it doesn't mean that the original detail is not historical. It means that somebody's seeing these connections, right? And I don't think that's not a confessional claim of, oh, well, it's Jesus in the Old Testament, right? It's that we know this is the way these writers were thinking. We know that they were thinking that this had to be grounded in the Old Testament. And it makes sense that when they had the chance, they would be drawing out Old Testament parallels wherever they happen to find them.
Are you, right? But can we use the historical method to get there, to say that we know what Jesus was thinking and that he looked in the Old Testament and said 12 tribes of Israel, right, so therefore I'm going to pick 12. Like based on the historical method, can we be confident that there even were 12 disciples?
I think the 12 is as good as you're going to get. So we have the 12 in Paul, we have the 12 in Mark, and then if you think John is an independent source, you have 12 in John, right? So that's 3 sources right off the bat, independent, that have the 12, right? So that you're already in like the realm of, this is something we can know as well as we can know the crucifixion, right? I think if Paul knows something and the Gospels know something independent, and then whatever other sources there might be in Matthew and Luke, because you have the 12 appearing in independent Luke and parables, you have the 12 appearing in independent Matthew stories. So as far as multiple attestation goes, the 12 is pretty good. I think the fact that Jesus had 12 disciples, we know that about as well as we're going to know anything, right? But that's a separate question from, what was Jesus thinking when he picked 12? Well, of course we don't know that. But, we can know that 12 is a very significant number in ancient Jewish thought. We know that it's a loaded eschatological idea. We know that Jesus was probably an eschatological prophet, since we've got this eschatological apocalyptic message all over the Gospels. So putting all that together, we don't know what Jesus was thinking, but we sure have some hints. So
okay, I got to ask you to strap in your seatbelt because we're going into the speed round.
Okay.
So you got to 1 or 2 word answers, and there's going to be true and false maybe. Here we go. You ready?
How much worse am I allowed to do?
Now, again, this is based on your professional opinion. There's no right or wrong answers, I don't think. And so here we go. Who is the earliest biblical character you think existed in the past?
Earliest biblical?
Yes.
Oh, hell.
Who is the earliest biblical character you think existed in the past?
Oh, gosh.
Take your time.
Yeah.
It's a speed round, and your answer has to be, you don't have to defend it, just...
Yeah.
I have my answer, and I'm curious to see if it's going to be the same. Yeah. In fact, I'm going to type in the live stream chat. Don't look in the live stream chat.
Okay, I won't. Oh gosh darn it. No exist. Okay, I'm going to say Isaiah.
Isaiah. Okay. My answer was King David.
Okay. Yeah.
Paul got the First Corinthians Creed from the Jerusalem Council. This is from my friend Camille. So I got a lean true or false. Did Paul get the First Corinthian Creed from Jerusalem? From the Peter, James, and John, the Jerusalem pillars.
Creed? Do we mean the
First Corinthians?
Bit of 1 Corinthians 15?
Yeah. Lean true or lean false? Lean true?
Yeah, lean true. Sure.
Okay. The author of the Gospel of John had read at least one of the synoptic Gospels before writing his own. Lean true or lean false?
I think he did.
Okay.
True.
When Papias says Matthew wrote a gospel, he was talking about the Gospel of Matthew we have today. Lean yes or lean no?
There's two possibilities. One is he was and he was very wrong about it, or no.
So what's your guess? When Papias talks about Matthew, is he talking about the one we have?
No, it's not our Matthew, because he calls it oracles. And that's, whatever Matthew is, it's not oracles.
Okay, so when some people say that we know Matthew wrote Matthew because of Papias, you would say...
I don't think that's Matthew.
Okay.
What he's talking about doesn't... If either Papias is so wrong about Matthew, it's not worth caring what he says, or he means a different Matthew. That maybe our Matthew was based on. I don't know.
Okay. The author... Oh, I already mentioned this. The author of Acts used the works of Josephus as a source.
Lean true.
Okay. We already talked about this one. The author of the Gospel of Mark used the Elijah Elisha as a literary blueprint for some of his stories about Jesus.
Yeah, definitely lean true. I have a differing conclusion about the historical significance of that, but yeah, definitely true.
Okay. This is this is lean true or lean false. A video camera sent back in time would be able to record Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt.
Boy.
I need Jeopardy music.
I don't know.
You're right in the middle, 50-50?
I mean, here's the thing. I'm gonna say the video camera thing complicates it.
The reason why I say video camera is is something actually happening in the past.
So there's a part of me that's really open to the idea that Jesus had some kind of Egypt connection, because of the extent to which later opponents of Jesus freak out so much about him being a magician, and this is like an association with Egypt. So there's a part of me that, and I am fringe here. There's a part of me that kind of thinks there might be something to the Egypt story on that ground. I'm gonna say yeah. But Mary and Joseph, that's yeah. So I'm gonna say no.
You're gonna say no. You lean that didn't happen in the past. Okay. Video camera sent back in time would be able to record the wise men visiting baby Jesus.
Oh, that one. Points against is the Isaiah reference. Points for is the fact that it happens, like 2 years after Jesus was. Well, I'm gonna lean no.
Okay.
Yeah.
John the Baptist identifying Jesus as the Messiah. Could we have seen that in the past if we had a video recorder? John the Baptist saying, "Look, there's Jesus. He's the Messiah."
Points for are how did Peter and Andrew get the idea to follow Jesus so suddenly? Points against are it's not in Mark. So I'm going to say softly no on the grounds that it's not in Mark.
Okay.
But soft lean for on the grounds that Peter and Andrew are affiliated with John the Baptist and John, and then become disciples of Jesus. So how did Peter and Andrew start? It's Andrew and is it John? So there's some allegiances switch between John the Baptist to Jesus, and the idea that John told them to do it. I think that's an interesting case.
Okay. Could a video camera have recorded Jesus whipping people and overturning the tables in the temple square?
Whipping people, no. Whipping the animals to get their handlers to leave, absolutely.
Okay.
There's a little medical problem there, so yeah.
Could we have videotaped Peter denying Jesus 3 times?
Yeah, I think that probably happened.
Could we have videotaped Judas identifying Jesus with a kiss during his arrest?
Kiss, I'm going to put an asterisk after. Judas as a historical betrayal, yeah.
Okay. Could we have recorded the chief priest paying off the guards with money?
I don't think that happened.
Okay. Could we have videotaped Jesus being followed by crowds of thousands of people?
So crowds are a huge deal in Mark. So they have the biggest theological role in Matthew, but they have the biggest hindering role in Mark. So the fact that Jesus was dogged by attention that he didn't always want, I think that's almost certainly historical. So I don't know about the thousands, but was Jesus crowded to the point that it inhibited his ability to do what he wanted? I think absolutely.
Okay, this is the last one of this form, anyhow. Could you have videotaped Pilate asking the crowd for Jesus' release and releasing Barabbas instead?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I think there is some indication that the idea of releasing a prisoner was a historical phenomenon in Jerusalem. It doesn't quite match with the Passover timeline in Mark because you would release the prisoner to go eat the Passover, and Passover dinner's already happened in Mark. And then there is the scapegoat idea. So you have that. I'm gonna flip a coin on that one.
Okay. This is just some Old Testament stuff.
Long girl.
Your personal opinion. Do you believe there was a literal Adam and Eve?
I go with the archetypical reading.
Okay.
So there, John Walton, Lost World of Adam and Eve. I think he's pretty well nailed it.
Okay. How about Abraham?
Yeah, why not?
Moses?
Did it look like the movie Ten Commandments? Was there? I mean, this is just so hard because you're getting to the case where there's no evidence for a lot of these there's no evidence for or against, right? Like, what would evidence for Abraham look like? So there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I guess multiple attestations, sure. No, that's obviously ridiculous when you're talking about something that old. Some sort of foundational, leader figure of the developing nation. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, why not?
Do you think the gospel author of John invented things that read as historical, but are not historical?
So there's a few ways to break this down, right? One is did he inherit these stories from someone else, or did he invent them? Do I think there are things in John that are not historical? Yeah. Where those came from, I think, is a separate question. Did he get this from other stories that were known about Jesus? Or what I would also just say is probably the most likely place is they got them from prophetic oracles of people in the church who were still talking to the resurrected Christ, right? I think that's probably where a lot of the sermons in John come from. Is early Christian prophecy.
Okay, this is I know or I don't know.
Okay.
Who wrote the Gospel of John? Do you know or don't know?
I would say don't know.
Who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Do you know or don't know?
Soft lean towards a guy named Mark.
Okay.
I don't know who he was.
Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Do you know or don't know?
The name change from Levi to Matthew is really suggestive.
Of that we don't know?
Of there being somebody named Matthew behind this gospel. And there's also, so here's the other tough thing. There's writing, and then there's being the primary source behind it, or being how many hands are involved in these, right? So somebody named Matthew involved in the chain in a significant way. Yeah, I would definitely say probably, but yeah, but no, yeah, it's not over the 50% line, so probably not. No.
Do you know or don't know who wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts?
I mean, it's the same guy. Soft lean towards it being a guy called Luke, but how much we can know about him historically, I would say probably very little.
Okay. Do we know or don't know? This is all based on the historical method, by the way.
Yeah, I assume so.
Do we know or don't know how many letters were written by Paul in the current canon?
Yeah, we know within a pretty limited range, like it's not between 4 and 40, but it's, I think most people say it's between 7 and 10.
Okay. This is a little, it's still history, I guess. Do we know or don't know that the first century Christians, the first generational Christians, died for their belief in the resurrection? Died for their belief in the resurrection. The ones who would have walked and talked with Jesus.
Talked with Jesus. So I think Stephen is probably historical, but I don't know if Stephen knew Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, I think was probably martyred. But again, I don't know if we want to call him a historical follower, even though he clearly knew the historical Jesus. James the disciple was killed pretty early. But then, of course, there's the question of, did they die for the resurrection, or did they die for semi-related reasons, right? Because it seems like what Stephen actually died for was denouncing the temple. I don't know if that, is the thing that caused Stephen to denounce the temple probably his Christian faith? Probably. But I don't think that's not the same thing as he could have saved his life by denying the resurrection, right? So were there first generation Christian martyrs? Absolutely. Were there first generation Christian martyrs who would have been able to avoid martyrdom if they had denounced the resurrection? I think that's a lot harder to answer.
Okay. Do we know or don't know that Jesus said that after he leaves, the Holy Spirit would come to comfort?
I think that's probably a prophetic oracle. I think that's probably a prophecy. So, soft no.
Interesting. Based on the historical method, do we know or don't know that Jesus rose from the dead?
Yeah, so sorry, I kind of want to go back to the Old Testament. The historical method ones are, because I was kind of thinking more in terms of with the tools of the university, all of those figures I would say are no's. But just for me thinking as a literary,
that's
reader,
a great clarification, because I just
historically, can you prove any of those people? Absolutely not. Do I think as a reader of the, and you can't separate these parts of your identity, right? The part of you that is a Christian, the part of you as a historian, it's all the same Laura. So that on those grounds, do I think you can prove there was an Abraham? Absolutely not. Do I think there was somebody close enough to the Genesis description who was involved in it? Yeah, sure, why not? Yeah. So
okay. This is the part of the conversation where you might feel uncomfortable, and I don't want you to. So if you don't want to talk about this, but I'm really, really curious. A lot of the things you said, I agree with, especially based on the historical method. But do you believe that a man 2,000 years ago actually rose from the dead in bodily form?
I do. Yeah. I want to be very clear. I do not think you can prove it with the tools of history at all. Okay. I truly do not. I think you can prove things around it. I think you can prove that people thought he was resurrected. I think you can prove that a movement began on the grounds that he was resurrected. I think you can prove that the idea of Jesus' resurrection became a very foundational theological idea of this movement very quickly. So all that suggests against the idea that the resurrection was a belief that took a long time to develop. So that all might be very suggestive of some kind of historical event that specifically started this, among which your options certainly would be an empty tomb, I suppose. So that's the historical question. Do I think there was a physical resurrection? Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I remember when you talked to Hayden, your answer on why on that was like similar to the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. Would that be the right way of framing it?
Yeah, well, kind of. So here's how I would answer that. I think that there is at some point everybody confesses something that is not that is not proven by other things they believe, right? So at some point that you get some sort of infinite regress of what people believe, whether that is the scientific method, whether that is historical critical methods for reconstructing history. And I think the most foundational claim of the Christian worldview is basically confessional and relational knowledge, right? It's the idea that Jesus is alive and knowable and is of the fullest revelation of Jesus, is the fullest revelation of God. I do think that, and that is. I wanted to push back on the idea of it being the inner testimony a little bit, because it's not totally individualized knowledge, right? Like, I don't think it's not something that you believe just because you personally feel it, but it's also something that people confess in groups. Like, this is what the church is. It's known through more interactive and communitarian ways of knowing, like sacraments, right? So that's what I would. How do people know Jesus is alive now? They know he's alive by interacting with him. They know by interacting. They know by the way that anyone else is alive.
Yeah, you said that on Hayden's show, and I don't know if you remember when I did my video.
Yeah, I know.
I hit you hard with that one.
Yeah. No, and here's what I would say to your objection on the show. One is that it seemed like your primary beef with that was that the way that people know other humans now is through corporeality, right? Like hearing, seeing,
right.
And I think just right off the bat, that's easy to object to, because people still like talk on the phone and they text, like there are non-corporeal ways of knowing each other. And also the other part of this is that the church actually has found a way to bridge the gap between, we are embodied creatures, and embodied creatures interact with other bodies, and like that's where the sacraments come in, right? Like that's why people take the Eucharist every week. So have you ever touched Jesus's body? Well, yeah, I mean, the short answer is Christians touch him every week when they take the Eucharist. And is it this kind of is it evidentiary touching? It's not for anybody else. It's not, this is confessional knowledge, right? This happens in the church.
Yeah, see, my big thing is I don't want to be duped. I don't want to be fooled. And so if a lot of people say this is, oh, Doug, you're talking about scientism or something. No, it's just a matter of, like, how would we know if we're mistaken about a false belief? And so when I hear you say, it's like when I heard you say on the last time with Hayden that it's like the same, I think you used the word the same way as having a relationship with your husband. And then I kind of jumped on you there in my response video, because it's clearly not, right? You can't text with Jesus. You can't call Jesus. And I hear what you're saying about the communion, that I'm hearing you say that you believe that you're actually touching the body of Christ. And
I believe in real presence, yeah.
Yeah. But if that weren't true, how would you ever figure that out? Like,
so here's the tough thing. It seems like what you're thinking through is that we can only know something's true if it's falsifiable, right?
Not necessarily, but I think our confidence should go up and down accordingly. Like, I'm not saying you should stop believing it or whatever, but does it bother you at all that like a lot of people ask me, Doug, what would it take for you to become a Christian today?
Yeah.
And maybe it's just my personality type, how I was raised, or whatever, the environmental factors, but I would need to see something major, like 1 Kings 18, I take a Kleenex and I soak it in water, and you pray in the name of Jesus right now, and it lights up on fire. Yeah. If it's good enough for Elijah, it's good enough for me.
Yeah. Okay.
And but when I see these other things like the transubstantiation, however you say it.
Transubstantiation.
Yeah.
Which is different from consubstantiation, which is what I believe in, but that's not we don't have to get into fight.
Or this, I guess, what do you call it, like a sixth sense of a presence or something. I think to myself, how easily can humans be fooled by that?
So this is something my husband and I have talked about a lot. I call it the hypochondriac's dilemma, because my husband and I are both major hypochondriacs. We constantly, and so the coronavirus has been a nightmare. Like, we constantly think we have it, and this is something that we joke about a lot. Is that the kind of knowledge that I think religious knowledge is a lot. It's the same kind of the capacity of the human brain to make you feel something is incredible. No one is denying that. And like we joke all the time that my husband constantly thinks he's having a heart attack, and he could be. We could be blowing off a massive cardiac event, but no, I'm joking. But that's not I don't think that's a ridiculous concern at all. Like we know about things like the placebo effect. We know that the human brain is tremendously powerful. But I think the challenge is that I'm a very firm believer that there's more than one way to know something, right? And the kind of knowledge that you get in the university is not universal. It's not universifiable, right? It's not the kind of thing that we use to know, I think, some of the most important things we know. So the way that you like, how do you so just for instance, like, how do you know that you made the right choice in who to marry, right? Like, there's normally not an empirical way to find this out, or if there was, we'd actually probably find that kind of creepy and disconcerting, right? A lot of this is and people do experience tremendous self-doubt over whether or not they married the right person, right? But for the most part, a lot of that is relational knowledge that you get from interacting with another person, and a lot of it is just a personal settledness.
But would you say, like, I interviewed a guy, I don't know, about a year and a half ago, and he was a certain form of Hindu. And and I asked him about his relationship with his God, and he said that that Krishna was the starting point for him, and that I believe he said that he had a relationship with Krishna, that Krishna is the source of love and morality and hope and all these things. Would you say that he's incorrect, that he's wrong, that there is a God named Krishna who's the source, who is of this relationship that he's feeling or experiencing?
Yeah. So you're getting into some tough, weedy questions about the way Christians think about other religions and the way Christians think about universalism.
I'm not worried about Christians right now. I'm just worried about you.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's how I'm trying to think through it this way. The thing that here's the thing that doesn't bother me. I actually lived with a Muslim lady for a year, and I felt like I learned so much about religious knowledge and religious belief by just talking to her about it. And actually, no, I didn't live. I lived with her for 3 years. My goodness. Okay, time flies. I'm so old. But
I want to clarify. I didn't ask you if it bothers you or not. I'm asking you a more deeper question of, do you believe, I think his name was Sam. Do you think Sam was mistaken in his attribution of his experience, saying that Krishna is the source of his relationship? That this feeling that he thinks he has a relationship, would you say he's wrong?
I would not. I mean, I wouldn't call who he was relating to Krishna, but if he was relating to a God who is characterized by love and knowledge and by unity and by truth, I have a hard time saying that's a different one than the one I'm talking to.
He would say that. In fact, he used those words but he still used the word Krishna, and he also told me he said, no, Christianity's flatly false.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on the grounds, once you get to the question of whether or not, if you don't think that a God can be revealed in a person, then I think that is something that you're deeply mistaken about. But just on the level that there is a God who is involved in the world and is relating to people and is active within it and is revealing himself or God's self. I don't really like only male pronouns for God, but if God is revealing God's self to people in whatever capacity they can experience it. I think we're all. I think everyone who has an encounter with that God, I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that's. I'm not surprised by that people would be encountering God wherever they are in the world, right?
But if he says that this God is Krishna and says Christianity is false, it's a false religion, would you say that back? or no? Like that he's not saying this is the same God that you're worshiping.
Yeah.
He's saying, no, you're wrong, Laura. And
I mean, I think what I would have to say to that is that that you are I would say that that person is mistaken on the grounds that they deny that God has revealed himself as a person. I would say that's a thing they're mistaken about. But I think that can both be true in that a God of love and knowledge is genuinely trying to contact you and making connections with you. I think those things can be true at the same time.
do you see how I'm stuck though? Like if I'm a
Yeah.
if I'm a person who genuinely, sincerely wants to know what's true or not, and I see you and I see him, and I'm hearing that you can't use the historical method to get there. You maybe get partially there, but not all the way. And I think he would say something similar, that it's something more, it's deeper.
Yeah.
Is there any way for me to tell who's correct?
I mean, one thing I would say is, when we're talking about things like the historical method and the scientific method, we're talking about ways of exploring the world as we have it now, and things that are just for the most part inaccessible to us, right? So this is the big impetus for the creation of the historical method, is that most of time is not accessible to us, right? And we have to find creative ways to fix that problem and to reconstruct time for us. And a lot of the natural world is the same way, right? Like the scientific method is developed because we don't have the access to these things. So I think where I would, just, talking to you, I would ask what kind of evidence you would expect, what you expect to be looking for to find God, right? Because if God is accessible, it kind of stands to reason that we wouldn't need these intricate tools of discovery and reconstruction to go find God, right? It seems like God would be in the business of revealing God's self to people, right? And
well, can I answer your question? Because like you said, you asked
what kind of evidence would you expect?
I would expect, since I'm aware of all the defeaters out there, to use a term from philosophers, I hate philosophy. Since I'm aware of all these defeaters and how people are so easily duped and deceived and believe things that are not true, I would need something big and major.
Yeah.
And so that's why I mentioned first.
Kind of sensory data, what I think is what I'm hearing.
Well, the one I usually give is my sister, who I told you just passed away. Yeah, thanks. I often have said on my channel that, if Laura, if you came into her hospital room and prayed for her, she was totally paralyzed before she passed away. If you prayed for her in the name of Jesus, I know her situation. Like, this goes almost 20 years back of pain and suffering and paralysis and all that sort of thing. This is not secondhand knowledge. If you came in, prayed for her in the name of Jesus, and she got up, that would do it. My confidence would be high enough to say, there's something going on here. It's real. Now, if Sam did that and prayed in the name of Krishna and it didn't work, I go, oh, the correct, maybe the correct characteristics of this God is found in the Christian God.
Yeah.
Because it worked in Jesus' name. And this is 1 Kings 18, basically, what I'm describing.
Yeah.
So I would need something like that, because I just think that what you're describing to me, I would just constantly be in doubt that, am I fooling myself?
Yeah. No, I hear that. No, I definitely get that. So, I'm trying to think of like a helpful follow-up question for that. And also, I'm not, this is, to be really clear, this is not like a gotcha session. I'm not trying to evangelize you here. I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from with this.
I'm not against evangelism.
Sorry?
I'm not against evangelism. I think if someone truly believes that, I'm doomed or whatever. By the way, do you think if I die as a non-Christian, I just don't believe the core propositions are true. What do you think happens to me?
I tend to be I'm never gonna get a job. I tend to
You want me to unlist this when we're done?
On television right now, but
The people watching the live stream right now, this might be gone tomorrow morning, so enjoy.
No, so there's an early Christian concept called apokatastasis, and apokatastasis is the idea that sorry, I picked this room in this house because I thought the lighting would be best, and now it's starting to look like I'm catching on fire. But anyway, so
Well, speaking of hell, yeah.
Exactly. Maybe we're getting a sign. So the idea of apokatastasis is that God is reconciling all things to himself, right? That God is that the end goal for creation is that everything will be what God meant it to be. Everything will be fully redeemed, everything will be fully restored, everything will be united to God. And this idea lost ground pretty quickly in the 4th century, but I actually think it makes the most sense of the New Testament writers. So I tend towards Christian universalism, which is the idea that what God accomplished in the death and resurrection of Jesus is efficacious for not just all humanity, but all of creation. So everything that God made will be redeemed. So I mean, all that is to say, I think your sister has been resurrected, and I think you will be too. I don't expect that to be any comfort to you right now because I know you don't think that, but I do. So
So you believe I will be, whether I accept it or not, I'll go to heaven?
yeah, I think you will. I think you will. I think you will. I think you'll acknowledge who Jesus is once you've died. And I think that will, and I don't think there is anything that you could do in this life or the next, for lack of a better word, that would add to what God has already done for you. So I expect to see you on the other side, so to speak.
Do you? This is really interesting because I talk to a lot of Calvinists, and and they are probably screaming right now if they're listening. Do you think I will accept Jesus after I die because he will appear to me, or what? How does that exactly work?
Jesus, right? What is this language? We're not.
Yeah, well, forgive me. I was raised Mennonite.
Okay, yeah. I mean, here is what I think will happen. You know, Philippians 2, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, whether on the earth or above the earth or under the earth. You know, that everything is steering. When Paul envisions the end of everything, he envisions everything being put to rights, and part of this being everyone acknowledges that Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, that God was the crucified and resurrected Christ. And I would say that is part of the process of everything being set to rights. Whether that is a noetic experience, whether that is sensory, I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, that you will come to know who Jesus was. And I don't think it will be a sad day for you.
Well,
I don't think you'll be mad about it.
You might find this hard to believe, but I'm one of the few people on this planet, I guess, who sincerely does not desire to live forever and ever and ever and ever. Is heaven forever and ever and ever? Because I don't want that.
I mean, so much of this is really hard, right? Because like we're thinking about this in our creaturely bounding of time, in that we so when we think about forever, we're still thinking in terms of time being this linear thing that extends on forever. And I don't know if that applies to the resurrection. I don't know if that applies to God. In fact, I would assume it doesn't. But so I don't know. I mean, I think it can. I don't even know how we would talk about time when we're talking about the resurrection, right?
What about those people? This is not me. If it's true, I'll believe it. But I still don't want to live forever. But what about all those, let's say, atheists out there who said, no, I don't want nothing to do with this God? Is God going to remove their free will if we have it, and say, no, you're coming to heaven whether you like it or not? Or
Yeah. I mean, so here's what I would say is I don't think freedom is necessarily sorry, can I shut this blind?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Before you burn up.
Sorry?
Before you burn up.
Yeah, I am so sorry. I'm just gonna go right there, turn it, shut it, come right back. I will be gone for like 2 minutes. Okay?
No problem. No problem.
Hang on.
I got to talk to people anyhow in the chat.
Yeah, sounds good.
So yeah, I will answer your questions at the end. So remember the ones you typed. I should have told you. I apologize. I should have told you at the very start. But I'm very greedy today. I want Laura all to myself until the very end. Thank you for any donations I've missed.
That's kind of better. Okay. It's just kind of a creepy floating head effect, but I can actually see you now. So.
Oh, you can see me? Yeah, right. Right now it looks like you're wearing a white blouse or something.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Here, is that slightly better for the?
Yeah,
camera?
just try to keep the camera as still as possible. Otherwise, people will get seasick.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking about that I'm not going to go to hell.
Yeah.
And actually, we can get off that topic. I don't know. I think we'll get into the questions from the live stream chat now because there's a whole bunch. So if there's any questions, tag me at PineCreek, and I'll ask those questions. And I want to make sure that I've asked all the ones. Do you remember that first century Mark thing that we thought that some people thought?
Yeah, geez, that was a whole dust up. We knew it was going to be bad though as soon as it happened.
Well, some people didn't know that. Like I did a video on who was it? Dan Wallace, Craig Evans, Gary Habermas. They all went full. Yes.
As soon as it happened, I knew it was going to be bad. Yeah.
What's your undergrad in?
Religious studies and creative writing, actually. Okay. I went to Indiana University.
Okay. And what brought you to North Carolina?
Duke did, basically. I did both of my masters in Wheaton College in Chicago. I talked about this a little bit on my show with Hayden, but I was a religious studies major at IU. I loved it. I loved studying history, and I felt like, I was still very much part of the whole, conservative white evangelical movement, and I really wanted to basically do apologetics, to be honest. And so I got really good at like what I thought was just parroting back the answers that I thought my religious studies professors wanted to hear at IU. And I thought, I'm going to go get my master's at Wheaton College, and then I'm going to learn how to really study biblical history. And then I got to Wheaton, and it turned out that biblical history is the same wherever you go. And it turned out that, at Wheaton, they weren't doing apologetics. They were dealing with all the vagaries of history. But I stayed the course. I loved it. I did 2 masters there, one in theology and one in exegesis. And I wanted to be an academic the whole time. I wanted to teach at a college, and that will probably never happen for all kinds of coronavirus-related reasons. So
since this is Duke, I'm assuming there's no statement of faith or anything you have to sign, right? Yeah, because it's not a religious institution.
No, I'm in graduate school. So, there's no religious commitment in the grad school.
That's good. We've got a question from Progressive Beard. What's your thoughts on Richard Carrier's work and people who don't believe Jesus existed? Very briefly, what's your opinion?
No, Jesus existed. I'm so sorry. I know it would be so juicy if he didn't. No, he existed. Paul knows about brothers of Jesus, the historical brothers of Jesus, and historical followers of Jesus. That's too soon. Jesus was definitely a real person.
Alexio Gomez. Hey, Alexio, good to see you here again. I interviewed him a long time ago. Ask her about what necessitates Jesus' Great Commission, if recognition of his lordship isn't necessary for salvation, meaning I'm still going to go to heaven. Yeah. What does it mean to preach the gospel? What does it mean for Jesus dying for...
Yeah, so in the Gospel of Matthew itself, I think the purpose of the Great Commission isn't it's not that they need to go out and preach some sort of like noetic gospel that people will then believe in and become converts. I think the role that it has in the Gospel of Matthew is signifying that the gospel is no longer just for Jews, right? Because the word there, so go to all nations and preach the gospel. The word for nations there is the same as the word for Gentiles. Go to all the Gentiles and preach, which is significant because in Matthew 10:5-6, you have Jesus telling the disciples to go only to the lost sheep of Israel, right? So there's a change after the resurrection, that it's not just for Israel anymore, it's also for Gentiles. So I think the primary import of that passage is not necessarily that people need to go preach on street corners. It's that this is no longer a ethnically bounded thing. But I think, but the impression I get is the larger question you're asking is why become a Christian right now if everyone goes to heaven, right? That's what I assume you're asking. And it goes to show how absolutely impoverished the American understanding of Christianity has become, that we really have just made it such a fire insurance thing, like, well, do you want to go to hell? No. The obvious reason to become a Christian, I think, is because if you believe this, it's true. Why would you not want to believe something true, or why would you not want other people to believe something true? Right. Especially, which I think most Christians do, that believes that it makes people, less alone. It makes them less. It makes them not hopeless. It gives people a hope after death. I obviously I would want that for people.
A guy like me, this might sound bad, but I don't have those. Everybody has those problems. But I'm not an anxious guy.
Yeah.
I tend to make more right decisions than wrong ones. I don't worry. I don't have any health problems. Maybe I'll get terminal cancer tomorrow and then I'll find Jesus. I don't know. What do you say to a guy like me who's just, I'm pretty content with life?
Yeah. I mean, here's what I would say is that part of believing that the foundation of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus is that it eliminates any need to create a need for Christianity, right? So I really don't like the whole, the evangelistic model where you like take somebody aside and you say, look, you got this serious problem and the problem is God. He wants to send you to hell, right? And I think that is creating a need that you will then come in and fill.
What did Jesus save us from, though?
Sorry?
What did Jesus save us? He came to save, right?
I would say, what's the 30-second version of this? I would say that Jesus came to save us from what is wrong with the world. So all of the ways in which human nature has been distorted, all the ways in which the world has been distorted through violence, through greed, through selfishness, I think that part of ourselves, that part of the world was done away with on the cross. What Paul calls the flesh, right? Which I think is just sort of a way of describing what is wrong with the world. This thing that is sort of enslaving people and making us not do what we want to do.
If you became me starting tomorrow, what would change in your life? Do you think you would have less hope, less meaning, less purpose?
That's a really tough question.
You would still get to keep your hair.
What?
You'd still get to keep your hair if you became me tomorrow, but other than that,
I can keep my eyesight. I don't need that. I think in a few ways, in some very foundational ways, my life wouldn't change because I think I would still like New Testament studies, whether I was a Christian or not. I just like history. I'm just the kind of person who likes history. I think I'd feel a lot more grief for people I've known who have died. I was really close to my grandmothers and I was really close to one of my aunts. And I think the idea that they weren't anywhere would be really devastating. And also just think, future wise about, like my parents and, I have an identical twin who's a huge part of my identity and my husband, I think the idea that those people are just a blip. I think I would feel a lot of grief for that.
Okay. Yeah, I get that.
I also think I would struggle a bit with. I think the injustices of the world would seem a lot more insurmountable if it really was just on us to solve all this. Because what I don't think is true is that theism gives you an out to not care about things like hunger and poverty, right? Like I actually think theism puts a tremendous burden on people to care about those things, Christianity in particular. But I think I would feel a lot of despair that I was never going to be able to do enough to solve this. So I think that those are the things that come to mind off the top of my head.
Okay. I'm starting to feel guilty for the people in the live stream chat who've given a donation, a super chat, and I haven't acknowledged it. So if it was like really early in the show and I missed it completely, just say, hey, Doug, I gave a super chat. Here's my question, and type it in the live stream chat. You don't have to give again, of course. But Paul James, thank you for your donation. Joshua White, thank you. He said, hey, this is the best interview you've done. Please have her back. Well, there you go.
Anytime.
Brian Stevens asks, when you were really into apologetics, what was your favorite argument?
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is, I've always been a feminist, so I think the whole women at the tomb thing, I kind of liked that for both sides, both that it might be an indication that this was historical, and also that you could really stick it to historical men for not believing women. That felt very relevant to me being in patriarchal churches, so I think that would be my answer.
Harley Wykes asks, we had a question about what you thought of Richard Carrier. What do you think of N.T. Wright?
Oh no, don't make me answer this. Okay. He writes really good Bible studies. I think he was out to lunch on the historical Jesus, and I think my biggest issue is that I think his whole schema of N.T. Wright basically got his start by trying to solve a problem that E.P. Sanders threw down. So E.P. Sanders said that Paul got this revelation from Jesus, and he had a solution, but the solution had no problem, and he just went around proclaiming the solution. So N.T. Wright's whole project was, well, let's go find this problem, right? So the problem he identifies is the sorry state of Israel, and that Paul's whole work is trying to solve the prophetically disappointed Israel. And I just don't know how much I buy that. How much like Joe Israelite in the first century was walking around saying, well, when are we going to get our cool new temple? I actually think I have no problem with the idea that Paul was proclaiming the resurrected Jesus and didn't really have a square problem in mind, especially before he got started, for what Jesus was trying to solve. So that's kind of my short answer. He's a nice guy, though. I like N.T. Wright as a person. So
Everyone Needs a Smile asks, can you ask her if she believes there is such thing as a bad reason to believe in Jesus?
Bad reason to believe in Jesus. Jesus for Christ.
What'd you say?
Youth for Christ.
Youth for Christ?
No,
oh, wow.
Of course there's a bad reason to believe in Jesus. There's all kinds of bad reasons.
Name one bad reason specifically. Like if someone says, I'm a Christian because of...
The worst reason to believe in Jesus is because he's mentioned in Josephus. That is the dumbest reason to believe in Jesus.
Believe in Jesus as... I think the questioner is asking Christ, not just Jesus.
To believe in Jesus as the Christ. Okay, I stand by my answer. The dumbest reason is because Jesus is attested in non-Christian sources. That is a very stupid reason to believe in Jesus.
Okay. Remember, if you're not tagging me, I probably won't notice you. Paul James asks, should personal experience trump historical method?
I don't know when it would be in conflict with historical method, because they're two completely different ways of knowing, right? Like I'm never going to have a personal revelation that tells me something about something verifiable through history, right? Like I don't think you're going to have a... I just think they're just two totally different ways of knowing.
Well, let me see if I can help Paul James here. What he's getting at is we know through the historical method, we're pretty confident that Elvis Presley is dead.
Yeah.
But I saw him yesterday.
Okay.
And I talked to Elvis yesterday. And he encouraged me. He sang to me because he knew my sister died and he wanted to uplift me. He gave me hope. Should that experience of Elvis Presley trump the historical method? Ooh, that was good.
I don't know. Part of this is it's tough for me to answer this question as a, because like as a historian, is the physical Elvis Presley dead? Yeah, absolutely. But I also don't, as someone who is open to the existence of the resurrection and the afterlife, the idea that, you might have had some sort of, edifying experience of Elvis Presley, like I'm not mad about that. I think that's, yeah. I think I would want to talk more to somebody who had that kind of experience about how they understood their experience and what the nature of it was.
And that's why you're here today.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah, I think that it's hard for me to draw a hard line in the sand on that one, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to get as much as Brennan Ho asks, what denomination do you belong to?
I have belonged to all of them. No, I currently I was in an ACNA church for 4 years, and then I married a United Church of Christ pastor. So that's where I've been since. I'm still a member of the Anglican North American Church, but I'm married to a United Church of Christ pastor.
Your husband's a pastor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have pastor's kids. You know how they turn out.
We'll see.
You kind of already answered this one, I think, but Devin Dotson asks, how do you personally vet her personal revelation? Oh, let me take this opportunity. I have this thought experiment that I often give, and it's in relation to Devin's question. Jesus is real, God's real, Yahweh's real, heaven's real, and I'm up there. And Yahweh, Jesus, looks at me and says, hey, Doug, you see Laura down there on planet Earth? We cut her off. We not hearing her prayers. We've ignored her. For the last 10 years, we've just cut Laura off. Now, here's the thought experiment question. Yahweh and Jesus only told me this information. They didn't relay this to anyone else, including you. The question is, how would you know the difference? You still think God is hearing your prayers, helping you, comforting you, being there with you. How would you know the difference that God has cut you off?
Here's what I would say is I think whoever it was who told you that there was one person they have specifically decided they are not interested in is not the Father of Jesus Christ. So I don't know who you were talking to. So I think it's, the premise of the situation, I think, makes it impossible to extrapolate beyond that. That's just not something God would do, right? And I think it gets hard to answer hypotheticals about something that
didn't God cut off people in the Old Testament?
I think
he even cut off Israel.
Well,
for more than 10 years.
I mean, I think that like prophetic, actions against a nation are different from deciding that a person is, has not been heard at all. And I also I don't want to overly literalize that. Like, I think the idea that God didn't, that God says that, if you continue to practice this injustice, that I won't hear you in the temple. I don't think that needs to be read as literally as God literally couldn't hear a damn thing, right? I think that a better way to understand that is that when you make imprecations against your enemies, I will not consider them to be my enemies because you're the ones I'm opposed to right now because of your behavior, right? And I think so the prophetic mode of saying that God is hearing someone or not hearing somebody is different from something is different than the kind of thing you're talking about in your thought experiment, right? I think in the analog to that would be you're in heaven and God says, the way Laura has been treating people is so appalling that I am going to, do this and that horrible thing to her until she realizes this is why and changes her ways. Then what would the difference be? Well, these things are happening and there's some sort of communicative act intended there because I can read the Psalms and so
this is, I think, similar to, I think I'm hearing you say what the Jews say, that we can tell the difference whether God is with us or not by whether he's blessing us or cursing us.
No, it's not. No. I wouldn't be. No, that's not what I mean.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying is the analog to the prophetic story, right? I don't think that maps on, but I don't think that maps on exactly to personal experiences of God, right? Because and there's also exceptions to those rules, right? We have the whole book of Job in the Old Testament, so there's no one-to-one correspondence between things are going well, God's on your team, things are not going well, God's not on your team, right? That's not a thing that is universally witnessed to anywhere in the theological reflections of the church or in the Bible either. That I was just using that to clarify what that was. Yeah.
Okay. Nathan Orman asks, Doug asks her, what is the best non-theist explanation for the resurrection? I think what he means is, what's a naturalistic explanation for the resurrection?
There is no naturalistic.
For the evidence that we have in the Bible. So what best explains the evidence, according to Christians, is that he did bodily raise. What could we have the evidence that we have? And
is there an answer besides the resurrection that best explains? Yeah. I mean, Paul's the outlier, right? Because the thing I would want to say...
Pick my answer.
What?
Pick my answer.
What's your answer?
Well, can you guess based on our earlier part of the conversation? Remember I brought up the Gospel of Mark?
I guess what you're saying is personal delusion, right? But I don't think that... Or like individuated delusion, right?
Yeah, for Paul, just like probably thousands and thousands of people on the planet every day have some type of experience that's not based in reality. The experience is real in their head, but not outside their head.
Yeah.
But what my answer would be, well, actually, I want to hear yours first. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest answer is community experience in grief, right? Like that's the easiest answer, that the community that Jesus left behind needed something to go on with that. But Paul is a major outlier there. And I do think that it is hard to find a historical motivation for Paul's resurrection. And I think even Christians miss this a lot, because a lot of times what happens is people want to do the Martin Luther thing, right? That the reason why Paul thought Jesus was resurrected was because he had this deep sense of his own guilt before God, and he had this deep sense of his own unworthiness. And I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. I don't think that. Sorry?
You want to hear my theory on Paul?
Yeah, tell me.
Well, this is just a guess, but remember we were talking about the PineCreek theorem, that the women have led more.
Yeah.
It says, I forget what letter he wrote.
Oh, don't tell me you're one of those Paul's wife truthers.
No, not a wife.
Okay.
But it says in one of his letters that his kinsmen were converted before him. So now we have a situation. Do you remember what reference?
I think he means Jews there, right?
Well, that's up to interpretation. Some people say that could mean family. It could mean just a broader community. But if it does mean his own family, now we have a situation where basically Paul, his own family converts, and he says, I got to stop persecuting because I don't want to kill my own family. I don't want to persecute my own family. So he converts, whether he had this experience or whether he just made it up or whatever. Maybe he didn't even write it. Who knows?
Well, he says that in Galatians that he had a revelation. So that we have the voice of Paul himself saying that the resurrected Christ appeared to him. This is the thing Paul says happened.
Yeah, I just think it's more probable based on how many people we've observed in history rising from the dead versus how many people in history we've had converting to religions because of family or having experiences that may or may not be reflective of reality. I still think it's reasonable to lower our confidence in Paul?
I would need to look at the specific verse people had in mind for that, just to look at the way that Paul uses that word in other places, because it is tough when Paul talks about like family language, because he uses that for people in the church all the time.
If it were true though that Paul's own family converted before he did, like I'm not talking about wife, but maybe his mom, dad, brothers, sisters, cousins.
In Jerusalem from Acts. That's we never really hear that much about his parents or anyone. No, it's definitely an intriguing theory that Paul knew other. I mean, he almost certainly did know people who were attracted to this movement, right? You know, he's going back and forth from Jerusalem, where you have a bunch of early converts. But no, and I don't. And I also think the idea that Paul had some kind of personal revelatory experience, that doesn't necessitate the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus, right? Like, one does not equal the other. But I think it can be true that there is, that Paul's explanation for why he converted is probably the best explanation we have. That for whatever reason, Paul had an experience where he thought where he came to have a very different understanding of who Jesus was. It also could have been something that happened in a church. That's the other thing. Doug Campbell has a whole theory about Paul seeing Gentiles speaking in tongues, and that this would have been a big shifting point for him, that seeing non-circumcised people receiving the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So that's not dissimilar from what you're saying, that Paul starts to see the effects of conversions around him.
Jesus appears to Pentecostals every Sunday at around 11:15 a.m. I used to go to a Pentecostal church, and I tell you, and no. I think you take, well, never mind. Right now, there's like a little guy inside my brain with a rope around one part of my brain saying, no, don't go there. We got to answer questions and finish this up. Brent Kalar, he's
I'm not going to die at the end of this interview, as far as I know. So if you ever want to come at me back,
What does she think about Luke Timothy Johnson? Do you know that name?
Oh, yeah. He wrote a great textbook. He's done some good work. He's very, he's like the one scholar who thinks the pastoral epistles were written by Paul, which is interesting. But no, he's got a lot of classic articles, classic books. You know, he's solid.
Danny Daniel asks, who are the theologians that she thinks gets it right, since most of them are wrong to her?
Starting more modern and working back, I tend to be pretty interested in the Reformed tradition. I do like Karl Barth a lot. I like Moltmann a lot, Jürgen Moltmann. I think he's done a lot of great work. I love female visionaries. I just read the book of Marjorie Kemp. I loved that. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard. I love the female visionaries. Teresa of Avila. So those are all good options. So.
Do you ever do debates?
I have never done one. No.
Okay, because everyone needs a smile. Ask if basically if you would debate a young Earth creationist or a biblical literist.
What's the point?
Good question. I think we should wrap it up. Are you getting tired?
Yeah, I'm done. Well, my husband just came in with the beer, so it might be time for me to have my evening beer and watch TV. So.
Sounds like a plan. But I want to thank you. This has been
yeah, absolutely.
Fun. The music has started, but I'll keep it down. Should we end in prayer? No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I can't see the live stream chat right now, guys, but this is my last question for you. When you pray, what do you pray for? What do you pray about?
It depends, right? You know, part of it is I pray all the time, so it's hard to say like any one thing.
Like, do you pray specifically, like when you found out my sister died, did you pray for me that I would be comforted, or are you more a type of prayer person who says, I pray for wisdom and guidance?
No, I mean, I would say that like my immediate response to that is I would definitely say that actually the vast majority of my prayers are some sort of like Thanksgiving or celebration related. Like, hey, God, I really thank you that Doug's sister doesn't have multiple sclerosis anymore. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind normally. Some sort of celebratory mode. So I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking for specific things. Or that's I think those are all different kinds of prayer, but for the most part I would say that when I pray it's celebrating things that I know are true about God. I'd say that's part of my prayers. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for coming on. The story about Noah and the flood, God drowned people according to the story, and I think Yahweh should have poofed them out of existence, like that. But thanks again for coming on. All you have to do is hit the X, and who knows, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Cool, this was fun. I hope you enjoyed it.
I did a lot. Thanks. Okay. Take care.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks, Erin Gruber. Yeah, she is awesome. Thanks, Brian Stevens. Best interview. Thank you both. Very honest. I missed a lot of super chats, I'm sure. I apologize. I'm scrolling up. I wish the home office in Wichita would give me a mod. Yeah, I see I missed a lot of questions. I apologize. I do find it very interesting that her husband was watching me say I loved her. Oh, boy. Poof. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Have a great day. Be safe. I don't know when I'll be back next, but probably next week early. Take care.